So in this stage in the series about how we can push back against dominant cultural institutions, I'm sure a lot of people are very frustrated. After all, I set out with the intention of creating a guide to push back against institutions that we're forced to interact with, and so far all I've really done is describe sort of an abstract theory about how these institutions are put together and how they function. How is this supposed to address the original problem I set out to solve? The problem of being forced to interact with a number of institutions that are dominated by the progressive left and having no way to push back against them. In this video, I think we can finally start to put everything together and show how a strategy would work. A strategy that might actually succeed at pushing back against a dominant cultural institution that you find yourself interacting with. Here, of course, I'm assuming that you have regular interaction with this institution, that it's something that you have a relationship with, and not some institution that you only have a one-time interaction or only sporadic contact with. College classrooms or local government meetings are ideal examples. In my own life living in a highly progressive urban area, there are a great deal of these progressive institutions that I have constant contact with. And moreover, these kind of institutions are where progressives accomplish most of their educational and propagandic goals. So it's important to take them on. At any rate, how do we use the tools and knowledge that I've already talked about to really push back against these institutions once we're engaged with them, or once we're forced to engage with them? So if you'll permit the brief review, at this stage in the series, we've already developed a number of resources, both an understanding of the battle we're fighting when we're fighting the culture war inside of institutions, and also one of the major resources we'll need to fight that particular battle, namely independent communities that are not dominated by progressive or cultural forces that we hope to oppose. In particular, we've identified the culture war as being one about developing educational institutions to teach basic beliefs and premises, and we have identified the fact that it's fought in terms of narrative and optics. Furthermore, when it comes to understanding institutions that are designed to educate people and push cultural narratives, we've discussed the various component members in such organizations, starting with the rather apathetic bystanders, moving on to the involved but not particularly ideological believers, the super involved activists, and finally, the priests or teacher classes that hold the whole thing together. So using these components, what can we do to really push back against cultural institutions? If we were suddenly to find ourselves inside an incredibly hostile cultural environment which we were forced to participate in, say for instance a college classroom, how would we push back against it? How would we make our voice heard? How could we create a counter-narrative? As we saw in part 1, the sort of God is not dead idea that you're going to come out with your opinions on your sleeve and fight back against the institution in earnest really isn't going to work. But what can you do? Well, at this stage, I think we're ready to take the things that we've already discussed and form them into a 5-point plan to push back against the institution that you're involved with. Now, perhaps here I should issue a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not at all claiming that this is some sort of definitive tried and true method to take down culturally dominant institutions or to push back in a college classroom. These are the methods that I have found to be helpful. The methods that I have found to work a little bit like a jiu-jitsu, using the institution's own strength against it. However, I imagine there are a myriad of approaches, but given how often I hear this question, and how often people ask me for specifics about what one should do in a situation where one is outnumbered and an institution is much more powerful than themselves, I feel that specific recommendations are called for. So without further ado, let's get started. The first point is to simply calm down, chill out, and get passive. We've already established that big, ostentatious, I'm wearing my opinion on my sleeve pushbacks are totally futile. They're not just futile, they're actively counterproductive to the type of message that you want to convey. The people who run these organizations are prepared for them. And they're ready to use passive-aggressive tactics to shut you down if you try any of them, even if you're ostensibly in an environment where pushback and rigorous controversial conversation is encouraged. The passive-aggressive tactics of the leaders will always overcome any attempt to take this type of tactic. So what do? Well, you do what you always do when passive-aggressive tactics are being used against you. When your opponent gets passive-aggressive, you get more passive. You take things easy. You take things slow. For the most part, let the priest or professor go on with their attempts to hold their conversation and really take a step back from the conversation altogether. And I know this sounds like it should be easy, but it's actually incredibly difficult because you'll likely be hearing all sorts of ridiculous things being said. And you'll have to essentially just shrug them off, at least for the early parts of whatever interaction you have with the institution. And here, the community you've developed outside of this interaction is essential. You're going to go insane if you have to day in and day out pretend like you don't care about being indoctrinated in an ideology that's distinctly against beliefs that you hold. You're going to explode, or you're going to have that natural tendency to try to find a middle ground, that ideological entropy that carries you over to whatever the opinion is in the majority. Either way, at this point, the community you developed outside this institution is critical. It keeps you sane. It keeps you in a mode of being open-minded and independent, even when everyone else is going along with the herd. You don't have to push back against what you're hearing here because you have another forum where you can push back against it. You don't have to convince yourself that everybody believes this ideological stuff because you have friends and communities that don't believe this. You're simply an observer. You're simply an ambassador, a stranger in a strange land who's hearing this and taking it all in. There's no obligation for you to accept it. It's just something strange that you have the ability to observe as a third party. Now, I know a lot of people might be thinking that this is very much like the Ben Shapiro solution of just keeping your head down as the ideological indoctrination goes on apace. But this stance of total neutrality and passivity is essentially just to help yourself become more engaged with the institution. This stage is to convince yourself that you do not need to actually have any interaction. Any interaction that goes on is purely your prerogative. They're saying words and you can take it or leave it, even if, depending on the institution, you might not actually be able to legally walk away. You're developing and strengthening your psychological defenses, and the more you can emotionally divest yourself from the ideology being taught, even if it's incredibly deplorable and wrong, the better position you'll be for the next steps. And so, that takes us directly to the second point or stage. Be a pure skeptic. Now, of course, here, when I say skeptic, I'm not referring to the position of internet skepticism or nominal new atheism. What I mean is assume a position in the class of pure negation, of pure criticism. You're the person who just can't be convinced of things, who's thinking deeper. You're the contrarian who just isn't going along with the herd, who's constantly contemplating, is this right what we're doing? Is this right what we're saying? And indeed, this is purely honest because if you're ideologically opposed to this institution, opinions of skepticism and doubt are probably the least of what you're actually thinking when you're being taught this stuff. But nonetheless, the position of skeptic and contrarian is so much more powerful, especially if done slowly and in a very passive way. Progressive and neo-Marxist thought in the West all springs up from an academic tradition which prioritizes above all else the role of the skeptic and critic. As such, if a person or a member of a learning community has identified himself first and foremost as somebody who is skeptical and unsure, he's almost unassailable by people who are not themselves total fanatics. There's almost no stronger position than to spend the first part of a given interaction with an institution remaining passive and polite, and the next part slowly developing a deep skepticism to the material being generated. And again, this is a lot easier said than done, because it's so important that this skepticism and this position of pure negation be taken from a perspective that is utterly polite and utterly sincere. And in most cases, a light, polite skepticism is an extreme understatement of what you're actually feeling and thinking all the time that this interaction is going on. You're in essence muffling your own opinions behind a facade of politeness and respect. Not that we shouldn't respect our opponents, but at the same time, it will definitely feel like you're not being true to your convictions. The whole endeavor may seem something like an 18th century French court where everyone is speaking in half-truths and concealed intentions. But nonetheless, that's just the game that you're playing. There's nothing wrong with being skeptical. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. There's nothing wrong with being unconvinced. And in fact, as you play that role, I think you'll see that the teacher or leader or priest in charge of the institution will take more and more interest in you. He'll try to make a greater effort to incorporate you into the conversation. And if it's working, he's very much unaware that you already hold a very, very different basic belief. And doing this brings us really to the third step or point. The third thing you can do from a position of relative passivity that will really begin the process of pushing back. And that is to become an astute observer of the institution that you're interacting with. Your goal here is to understand exactly how the dynamics work inside this institution. To go back to our previous model, who are the bystanders? Who are the true believers? Who are the activists and fanatics? And how does the priest or professor hold everything together? In this role, you act a little bit like an anthropologist studying some strange tribe. You're trying to discover exactly how everything works, exactly how the politics work of the group, exactly how people are being indoctrinated and brought into the belief that is being promoted by the institution in question. And in this position, you are in fact being a good student. You're just not really learning the exact thing they would like you to learn. You're learning how to be an anthropologist, where they're expecting you to learn how to be an ideologue. And again, this puts you in a very powerful position. You're learning everything about them. Their cards are going onto the table. And they really don't know very much about your position and your ideas. And through this process of observation and learning about the institution you're interacting with, you have to pay close attention to learning a particular thing. You have to learn the abstract, basic beliefs that the community relies on to make its case. The fundamental core assumptions, the core axioms, the prior beliefs that make everything roll into motion. And regardless of what anybody says, all institutions and communities have prior basic beliefs. They have assumptions they make. They're all abstract and they're all metaphysical. If someone tells you they don't have these beliefs, they're just bullshitting you. And your goal being an observer is to discover them. And of course, to use everybody's favorite example, we could look at a community of feminists. Now, what is the feminist core assumptions or beliefs? Well, if I ask this to people on the internet, they might say something like the wage gap, the belief that men have privilege, the patriarchy, something like that. But again, we're thinking more fundamental. What's more basic? I'd say their basic, most core belief is the fact that the only non-oppressive relation between the genders is one of total symmetric equality, with no differentiation. They believe there can be no complementarity, and subsequently, they believe that historically, any deviation from symmetric equality must be the fault of some notion of masculinity, whether abstract or real. Now, this may seem more or less obvious in the case of feminists, but rest assured, every group has one of them, and once you discover them, you have a key. Because at any point, you can just reject the basic belief. And with that basic belief goes every single piece of ideology the institution is trying to instruct you in, that the institution is trying to spread. And the true beauty about these metaphysical assumptions and basic beliefs is that most of the believers and bystanders, most of the casual people who are there, they don't understand them. I mean, sure enough, they accept the ideology because it's being taught to them. They accept the specific points. But the assumptions, the metaphysics behind it, the truly basic priors that we take that make everything make sense, that's just too abstract for them. They're not going to be able to understand it well enough to assent to it. They're not going to really understand how important it is, whether you agree to it or not. For instance, I could walk into a group of average feminists, loudly announce that I believed in gender complementarity and not gender symmetry, and I would not get the slightest bit of reaction. Whereas if I had said, I don't believe in the wage gap, every one of them would have jumped down my throat. And when you think about that, that's ridiculous. Feminism doesn't rely on the wage gap being true. The wage gap could be false, and feminists' principles still might hold absolutely on other areas. But if gender complementarity is actually the right way to do things, then almost all concepts in current feminist theory are false. But of course, your average feminist doesn't understand that, and there lies the weakness. Because you know who does understand how critical these core assumptions are to the narrative and teaching, the activists and fanatic group that we talked about previously. To them, when they hear you let on you don't believe in these things, they understand that their ideology is being threatened, and they will not like that one bit. And so this brings us to our fourth point in step. Escalate slowly. At this point, if you've done the other steps and points, you've established yourself as a passive, courteous skeptic. And if you understand the institution well, you also might know a core belief they hold that you do not. That may in fact be too abstract for any of the people who are more casual to even pick up on. And there you have a path open before you. Slowly start suggesting that you do not actually believe in a core assumption necessary to make the ideology being taught hold together. Suggest that you're really uncertain about the concept of equality, that you're really uncertain about the idea that progress even exists. Suggest that you find modernity and thought since the Enlightenment really troubling. And of course, to most people in that community who are casual, this will just be dismissed as the usual skepticism. But of course, for the activists and fanatics in the group, this will be a direct challenge. They'll start suspecting that your skepticism is actually a front for something else, that you're actually an enemy in their midst. They'll be chomping at the bit to engage, to have something that they can argue against. But if the terms are that abstract, there really isn't anything to argue against. Not yet, at least. You haven't given them any positive position to object to. The professor, priest, or leader will probably be in the same position. He might even know what you're doing, but at the same time, it's not his position to really challenge you on that. And if he does, he's really called his own authority into question, because he can't really criticize someone for being skeptical. He can't even criticize someone for disagreeing with the core foundation of his ideology, because to do so, he'd have to admit he has an ideology. And that would make the entire house of cards come crumbling down. So in essence, what you're doing as you escalate, as you suggest you don't actually believe in the core foundations of the system, of the ideology of the institution you're interacting with, you're blowing a heavy dog whistle that only one group can really respond to, the activists and fanatics. And it will drive them insane, because they will have zero support from the believers or the leader. And this is unusual to them. That's going to make them feel terrible, and they're going to fight back against it, and fight back against you harder than ever before. And this, of course, will be incredibly embarrassing for the narrative of the entire institution. The professor or teacher or leader is going to start being more worried about the activists and fanatics in his class embarrassing him than he will be about educating or promoting the ideology. He doesn't want to have a fiasco on his hand. And if those people lash out against you in a way that's embarrassing to him, he's got a serious problem on his hands. And so as this escalation occurs, you're going to have a situation where the professor or teacher is going to have a diminishing amount of control, and you'll have an increasing amount of control at your disposal. And of course, this leads straight to step or point number 5, dropping the bomb. Now, at this stage, you have a better understanding of exactly what can just tear this institution apart. The activists and fanatics are getting increasingly irritable, and everybody else who's more casual is wondering what's going on. Because to them, it seems like they're just getting angry at you for asking questions. The institution's ideology is showing more than ever, and the professor or leader is getting increasingly concerned about the optics he's presenting. He's concerned that the legitimacy of the institution might be being called into question. So at this point, it's probably a good strategy to get more passive, to let conversations carry on, to make it apparent that you're not disrupting the actual environment of the institution. At this point, you need to listen and wait for controversial topics to be brought up again. Once that proceeds, you need to listen and see if you can't find a moment in the controversy where the activists or fanatics go out on a limb and suggest something that would be seriously off-putting to the more casual bystanders and believers in the group. At this point, come out, matter-of-factly disagree with the activists and fanatics, and state then that this is probably why you don't agree with the fundamental basic belief necessary for the ideology to work. At this point, the activists and fanatics in the group will go absolutely bonkers. They've discovered a rat and they'll feel vindicated. But the optics of this explosion will be terrible for them. They'll look like paranoid ideologues trying to root out the people who disagree with them. And sure enough, that's exactly what they're doing. But as they get themselves triggered and absolutely fly off the handle, the professor or leader is not going to be able to stay back and watch this happen. The entire legitimacy of the institution in question is going to be threatened by this outburst, and if he doesn't calm things down, he's going to have a serious problem. So in all likelihood, he'll come in and recognize that your belief is legitimate and should be respected in the dialogue people are having. He can't do anything else. And this is a kind of a mission you might never get otherwise if you started strong. If you started with your opinions written on your sleeve. Because at this point you've established yourself as somebody who is very thoughtful, and therefore the revelation of this disagreement at a late stage will be all the more forceful. Moreover, it totally separates the activists from the more casual people who are trying to participate in the institution. Remember, the bystanders just want fairness. They just want to make sure that everything is going in a relatively equitable way. And if the activists begin persecuting or flying off the handle, they're going to recognize this as something fundamentally going wrong. Moreover, the believers are invested in seeing their ideology win on a fair playing field. And if they get the message that, well, really, this institution is not so much a forum where my ideology is winning, but rather just a clearinghouse where it's given pride of place without any kind of discussion, they're not going to feel very comfortable about that. They might even start having some doubts. And so, in this environment, the professor or leader is forced to intervene and intervene on your behalf. And in many ways, you struck a blow against the ideology that's being promoted. Your ideas are being recognized, and moreover, the optics and narrative of the situation are in your favor. You're the one speaking truth to power, and they're the ones that have to, at the end of the day, admit it. Now, of course, I can already anticipate some objections to this very specific 5-point plan. In some ways, it seems a little bit too neat and too cute, and moreover, have we really solved the problem? Have we really pushed back against the institution? As much as this plan creates optics for yourself that are beneficial, it's hard to see how this really changes anything. After all, the institution will continue to operate, it will continue to indoctrinate people. If you're in a college course, the course will proceed apace and the curriculum will not be largely threatened. So what good does this particular strategy give you? Well, it really allows you to fire a shot across the bow of the organization, to put them on notice. It allows you to get your ideas out there and have people that wouldn't otherwise consider them actually be more curious. The natural invincibility of the institution has been called into question, and this provides an opportunity for you to take these interactions and turn them into larger ideological gains. But of course, this will be the subject of the last video in the series.